everybody, and welcome to Talk of the Bay with your host for today, Meilin Obinata. We're going to give you the scoop on the controversy over ethnic studies in the Pajaro Valley Unified School District. Our guests today include Omar Dieguez, Maximiliano Barrazas, Lourdes Barrazas, Bobby Pelz, Chloe Montgomery Gentile, and Christine Hong. Could everybody introduce themselves, starting with Omar?
My name is Omar Dieguez. I work with Barrios Unidos. I'm an Elevate Youth Coordinator.
Thank you. What about you, Bobby?
My name is Bobby Pelz, and I teach ethnic literature and studies at Watsonville High School in Watsonville.
Thank you. Maximiliano, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm a student at Pajaro Valley High School. I'm a freshman.
Thank you. And Lourdes Barrazas?
I'm Maximiliano's mother. I'm also a psychologist.
Thanks. Christine Hong?
Hi, I'm faculty at UC Santa Cruz in the Department of Critical Race and Ethnic Studies.
And Chloe Montgomery Gentile, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Chloe. I grew up in Santa Cruz, and I'm currently a teacher of ethnic studies in United States history at Menlo-Atherton High School, and I'm soon to be a teacher of ethnic studies in world history at Notre Dame High School in downtown San Jose. Excited to be here.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to kind of get a chronology going. So actually, if Christine, you could start us off with some context of the Third World Liberation Movement, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I think that it's really instructive to know that ethnic studies in its origins students fought for ethnic studies, but not under the banner of ethnic studies. Instead, they fought for ethnic studies under the banner of the Third World Liberation Front strike. And this is well over half a century ago at two Bay Area universities, SF State and also UC Berkeley. And in both instances, students who were fighting for ethnic studies, they actually were challenging the university during a time that when the United States was waging a devastating war of aggression in Vietnam, and the U.S. Research University played a very critical role in aiding and abetting that war effort. And the students who fought, and I always say this, ethnic studies comes with a struggle. And that was true back then, and that is certainly the case today. And it wasn't as though the students were just asking for a little bit of representation in the curriculum that already existed. They weren't asking for just a few more seats in the classroom. What they were doing was they're fundamentally challenging the structure and the purpose of education. And instead of education being geared toward reproducing the social status quo, these students, under the rubric of the Third World, were actually fighting for liberation from racism and imperialism, not only abroad, but also domestically. So, I guess I will just leave it there, but I'll say that one real indication of the threat that they posed was that at SF State, the head of the university, the president, Hayakawa, sent in a tactical unit of the SFPD to come and pound heads, and students held out for 5 months. They went on strike, and at UC Berkeley, then Governor Ronald Reagan he deployed the National Guard also to go in and bust heads, but the students held out for 3 months. And from that was the origins of ethnic studies. And I want to say something too. That rubric of Third World, why did they choose that? Because the students who were fighting for ethnic studies viewed themselves in empowered terms as part of a global majority. They didn't view themselves as a national minority.
Thank you, Christine. I'd like to have Omar jump in here and explain your passions when you were going to high school. How'd you get elected as student body president? So now we're going from like the 1960s to
the early 90s.
Early 90s, yeah. All right.
So just a quick We were the first students that were bused in from Watsonville High School all the way to Aptos because of overcrowding. And when that was happening, there was a big fight to keep us from going to Aptos High School from mostly the parents that were at Aptos High. They said that we were lowering the classroom quality education. We were bringing gangs to their school. And so what happened was there was a Proposition 187 back in those days that talked about taking rights from migrants, and that inspired us to fight and to make a movement to bring equality to Aptos High School, since we were already dealing with segregation because the parents were trying to segregate from the district because they didn't want us there at the school. So that motivated me to run for student body president. And we organized, we educated ourselves on the process. We seen that there was no representation in the student body, so we decided that we were going to run for every single position that year and try to get our voice heard in the student body. So we ran for every single position, and I ended up capturing the student body president. We won we got the vice president, Carmen Becerra. We had all the other positions, except for one I think we didn't take over that year, but that's how we got into the student body and started making changes at our school. And just the need of equal rights was what motivated me to fight for that and stand up for our cause and our movement.
What happened during your presidency? Was it all smooth sailing?
No, it was not smooth sailing. There was, like I said, a lot of opposing, and it wasn't even from the students. It was mostly from the Watsonville students that were fighting against the parents from Aptos. It wasn't even between the students. It was a battle between the Watsonville students and the parents at Aptos, wanting us not to. They were trying to segregate from the school district. And a couple of weeks after I got elected student body president, I got accused of being in a drive-by shooting by the principal. Got pulled into the office. He implemented that I was involved in it somehow. What happened was I walked out of that classroom. I was in history class, and we had a teacher. His name was Carlos Mujal, who was very, very good teacher. He reminds me of Jaime Escalante from Stand and Deliver. That he was that kind of a teacher that was very passionate about what he did, and he had me come into the classroom and explain to the classroom what happened. And from there was a big movement between the students to organize to have the principal apologize for this because it was a false accusation. We ended up getting rid of that principal, and from that sparked a lot of movement for Chicano studies. We fought for Chicano clubs, Mecha, Movimiento Estudiantil Chicanos de Aztlán. We fought for, we wanted murals on campus, and it just, that whole movement, there's a lot to it that happened in that movement, and a lot of battles were fought. And there was a lot of the newspapers documented the whole thing. So there was a lot of, I had to face a lot of accusations through the newspapers where they were putting articles in there, just blasting on me, just trying to degrade my character. And somehow I got through it, and here I am today, still fighting a battle with, these young generation that are still fighting the same battles that we were fighting back then. And it's very inspiring to see that these young generations are still doing the same thing that we were doing 20 plus years ago.
So just for context, how old were you when you were being elected and facing accusations?
I was between the ages, so this is probably started my sophomore year all the way through my senior year. So I don't remember how exactly, maybe like 15 through 17 years old.
Wow.
Yeah.
So basically,
this
like
battle was,
even before you could drive,
yeah,
you became student body president and facing accusations from the administration.
And to win the student body presidency at Aptos High School was a battle itself, because I think 55% of the school was Anglo, and then the other there was like 40%, which was composed of Chicanos, and then the rest was a small percentage. So in order to win the presidency, you have to get more than 45% of the school to vote for you, and it was a good battle. Our strategy was to start doing things at school instead of waiting to get elected. So we started organizing peace and unity between the gangs on campus. We started to organize events to bring the school together, cleanups and all kinds of stuff like that. So our strategy was to do things before we got elected.
Wow. So actually, that's great. I think a lot of elected officials could benefit from doing the work before they get the job.
Yeah, that would be nice.
That would be really
yeah.
nice. I want to move us into more current times. Does anybody want to jump in and kind of explain, like, the California Ethnic Studies curricula in 2019, like the evolution from 2019 to 2021?
I'm happy to take that on.
Okay, thanks, Christine.
Even before 2019, when Governor Brown was in office, there was the passage of AB 2016. And that particular law, it recommended the teaching of K through 12 ethnic studies. And what was so significant about this is that ethnic studies, and we just had a wonderful town hall recently with Alison Tintiango-Cubales, who is the founder of Community Responsive Education. And she had a really important corrective. She said that, ethnic studies, we have these tales about how it began with the Third World Liberation Front strike, but actually began in community struggles against racism. And, what's so interesting about ethnic studies as a field is, in the first instance, it's the first field that emerges from below, from grassroots struggle in university settings. So every other field either comes from a kind of Western classical education, or it emerges because robber baron capitalists actually dictate the formation of entire fields within the university. And so this sort of challenge, this democratizing challenge to education that ethnic studies represents from below, it sort of percolates at the university level. It has a varied sort of realization at the K through 12 level. And finally, around 2016, almost 50 years after the emergence of the first ethnic studies programs in the nation, there's the discussion about having it be recommended at the high school level. At that time, ethnic studies practitioners who had fought for this understood that a requirement would be forthcoming. And so soon after, there was the passage of AB 101. And this represented the making of ethnic studies as a requirement at the high school level. And by the 2025-2026 academic year, ethnic studies has to be on the books at all high schools throughout California. And the graduating class of 2029-2030 has to have taken ethnic studies in order to graduate. But what's significant about the trials and tribulations of ethnic studies at the state level of the California Department of Education is that there was a group assembled by the CDE of ethnic studies experts, people like Alison Tintiango-Cubales, who are seasoned, who are known practitioners, who have a long history within the field. And it makes absolute sense that you take the subject area experts to develop the curriculum, and they certainly did. And what they did was they were supposed to create a draft curriculum and then have that circulated for feedback from the state. And so they actually created an initial California ethnic studies model curriculum. And this was almost a 700-page document. And the controversy that landed on this curriculum was that in a section under Asian American Studies, there was a course module of Arab American Studies. And this Arab American Studies course module included the mention of the occupation of Palestine. It mentioned the boycott, divest, and sanctions movement. And it also mentioned that the system that Israel has imposed upon Palestinians is apartheid in nature. And this ignited a firestorm of controversy, including with Israel-funded groups actually targeting ethnic studies practitioners. And so what happened at the CDE level was that all mention of Palestine was violently expunged from ethnic studies, and there were many modules that were added about anti-Semitism. So one thing that I just want to underscore here is that ethnic studies as a field, it actually centers the perspectives of communities that have been impacted by structural violence. And it centers their perspectives and their ways of knowing, and it centers their experiences. And so this is something that is foundational to ethnic studies. And so the violent excision of Palestine and Palestinian experience of settler colonialism and apartheid was very much against the grain of ethnic studies as a field.
We're going to break right now. You're listening to Talk of the Bay with your host, Meilin Obinata. We are diving into the controversy over ethnic studies in the Pajaro Valley Unified School District. We're back on Talk of the Bay with your host, Meilin Obinata. And I want to go to our guest, Bobby Pelz, a teacher of ethnic studies. Can you tell me about what it was like to be involved in the development of ethnic studies in the PVUSD?
Sure. I mean, it was very difficult. I'll say that first. I remember the early days when there were just four of us who were working on the ethnic studies program, and the four of us were sitting in a room in the district office, looking through books, looking through, rethinking ethnic studies, looking on YouTube, looking on the internet, trying to figure out how exactly are you supposed to teach ethnic studies? Because, none of us had a degree in ethnic studies, none of us had taken an ethnic studies class before, and all four of us were white. And so, we were kind of starting from ground zero.
Did you feel like I'm about to commit teacher malpractice?
I was very nervous about doing this correctly. Social justice is really, really important to me, and I see ethnic studies as a social justice kind of a class, and I wanted to do it right. So, yeah, it was definitely scary to embark on this. And I remember, too, one of the things we did is we developed this whole outline, this whole unit plan. And it was the kind of thing where it was like, okay, first we're going to talk about African Americans, then we're going to talk about indigenous people, then we're going to talk about Latinos, And I remember we looked at it and we thought, this isn't right, this isn't ethnic studies. And we tore the whole thing up and we started all over again. And that happened many, many times.
So what was it like to have the trustees of the PVUSD vote on a contract? I believe it was like a 3-year contract with CRE to actually develop a curriculum. What was the reaction?
For the initial vote?
Yeah, for the initial vote. Let's do this 2-year contract or 3-year contract with development of curriculum and then implementation. How did that sound to teachers?
Well, I think the initial contract was great. I think that we finally got the expert that we needed to make sure that we were doing this correct. And I think it took away some of that stress and some of that fear of we're not doing this right, because we were able to bounce ideas off of experts. It wasn't, the CRE organization brought in lots of people to help us. And it was great because we were talking to other high school teachers that were teaching ethnic studies that had a lot more experience than we had. And so then we were able to kind of get feedback on the things that we were doing, as well as ideas of how to properly teach the things that we wanted to teach in our district.
Thanks, Bobby. I'd like to go to Lourdes Barrazas. So you're a parent in the PVUSD. What did you see about this class impacting like the performance of your children? Did you see results right away?
Yeah. My son came home really excited to talk about the things that he was learning. In our home, we talked about some of the issues that come up in society, and we actually started talking about this when the murder of George Floyd came up. And so that's when, our kids started asking questions. So we started to talk a little bit more about, racial issues in society, inequities, oppression. And so when my son started taking this class, he's like, wow, he just like really loved it. He, his critical thinking just got better. He was asking so many questions. And, it was the first class we ever saw him like really be that curious about things that affect, kids or just society in general.
Maximiliano, so your mom is saying that it was a subject that really woke up your passion for school. Before you took ethnic studies, what did you know about California history?
So just like the typical things you learn in like the California curriculum, you like the California mission system, the Donner Party, the Gold Rush. Essentially, we kind of just learned how people got here and like what's like some of the settlements, but that's about it. I don't even think we really covered the fact that California was part of Mexico until like 8th grade. I think I just always thought it was part of the United States until 8th grade, once we started learning about Manifest Destiny. So safe to say I didn't really know much.
And so once you took the ethnic studies class, what did that do for you?
So once I took the ethnic studies class, it's like I just my whole world changed. I had like I felt like I was ignorant before.
Wow.
With how much I knew. And I started getting curious, because then I started realizing that there were gaps in my knowledge. Before, I thought it was just like, oh, everything fits so nicely together, and I just didn't question it. But then I started to realize that things are very messy and interconnected. So then I actually was able to track things back to their roots and figure out where things came from and see how those things are connected to other things.
Can you give me an example?
I don't know if I can give you an example right now.
Okay, that's fine.
Sorry.
That's okay. I didn't tell everybody there'll be a quiz on this show. So we've heard from Bobby Pelz, who is a teacher in the PVUSD. We also have here Chloe Montgomery Gentile, and want to ask you, what are your goals as a teacher of ethnic studies?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I really became a teacher because I wanted to teach ethnic studies. I grew up seeing my mom be a teacher and all of the struggles that come along with that. And it was kind of something that I didn't really want to get into. But when I was in college, I started taking ethnic studies classes, and I felt like they really provided me with the language that I needed to describe my experiences that I had had growing up in Santa Cruz and being one of the only Black students in a lot of my classes at Santa Cruz High. And so I was working in an after-school program, and I just decided that it would be really empowering to be able to be a part of the change of bringing ethnic studies to K through 12 education and making history accessible and relevant to students. But really my main goal as a teacher is to provide students with the kind of support that I wish that I had had as a student. I had a lot going on outside of school, and I felt like I was only seen as like a means of production, like just focus on the schoolwork and not necessarily seen as a person. And so I really want to see my students as whole people and create space for them to show me who they are outside of the classroom. And then, also just feeling the joy and seeing the aha moments that students have when they actually see themselves represented in the curriculum, which is something that I get to do a lot as an ethnic studies teacher. So, yeah.
Thank you. And teaching in the Menlo-Atherton School District, what is considered diversity there might be quite different from, say, in the Pajaro Valley Unified, because you're in Silicon Valley, and there's a different mix of the population is highly varied, and specifically at Menlo-Atherton. Do you want to just give some like demographic context? I don't know if
for
that's
sure.
Okay.
Menlo-Atherton is a pretty unique school because I would say about half of the students come from Menlo Park in Atherton, which is a really wealthy area, heart of the Silicon Valley, Facebook, all those big tech companies are there. And then the other half of my students come from East Palo Alto, which is a less wealthy area. I would say about half of the school's population is Latinx. And then maybe 30% is white, maybe 20% Asian. I'm just going off the top of my head. So if y'all want the actual stats, and then 5% black.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's in this, so you're teaching ethnic studies in this very mixed environment. And I read that there was a petition about you. Do you want to explain kind of how that came up?
Yeah. So kind of like Christine had mentioned before, when ethnic studies became a required class in California, it was passed through this law called AB 101. And like she mentioned, in what is considered a part of like the approved curriculum for California, it completely excludes any history on Palestine, and it essentially erases what's known as MENA studies, which is Middle Eastern and North African studies. And so I taught a lesson on the ongoing conflict in Israel and Palestine in November. I honestly thought that the lesson had gone super well. I didn't receive any complaints from my students during the classroom, during the lesson. And I actually had gotten the lesson from another teacher who had taught it in her EML, which is Emergent Multilingual Learners, in that classroom, and also had received no complaints. So I taught the lesson. It went relatively well. I taught it as part of a unit that we do in ethnic studies on dominant and counter narratives. And so really it was like a case study within that unit and a way just to address the questions that students had been bringing up based on what they were seeing on the news. So I taught this lesson, and I would say about 2 or 3 weeks later, I was initially informed that there were complaints about the lesson. I still don't know how many of these complaints actually came from my classroom, but my guess would be 1 or 2 students were upset and showed the slides, which I had posted publicly on my Canvas page, showed those slides to their family members, who then shared out the slides to Israeli-funded anti-ethnic studies groups that essentially harassed me, created a petition that called for me to be fired, garnered maybe around 30 to 60 people to come to school board meetings to call for me to be fired. I was getting 5 to 20 emails per day requesting access to the slides that I had used. And I would Google who these people were. And they're mostly coming from out of state, lots of them coming from Israel. And the harassment got to the point where there were posters outside of my classroom door. I got a book called Woke Anti-Semitism left in my school mailbox with a cryptic message in it, and that was anonymous. And after all that, I essentially took a stress leave of absence because it was having a major toll on my health, and I was just feeling honestly really scared. But essentially, I was targeted by a few different groups. The Jewish Community Relations Council, the Alliance for Constructive Ethnic Studies, and the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. And none of these groups spoke to me directly. It was essentially, you taught something that was outside of the scope of AB 101. That is anti-Semitic. You didn't address the Holocaust enough, and you need to be fired. This, I think, just to provide context, I'm also the only certificated Black teacher on my school's campus, and I'm the advisor for the Black Student Union. And these petitions, these calls for me to be fired, ultimately were I guess, met, and my principal did non-reelect me for the following year. He didn't give me any reason for why I was non-reelected, but it was clearly in response to this petition, especially given that my school had agreed to begin teaching an AP African American Studies class next year with me as the teacher. And more Black students than have ever signed up for an AP class signed up for that class, and it's now canceled because they fired me over one lesson plan that I gave several months ago.
Okay, I want to ask you more questions. That is devastating to hear that I didn't know that you had lost your livelihood. You're listening to Talk of the Bay with your host, Meilin Obinata. We're discussing the controversy over ethnic studies.
No dark sarcasm in the classroom. Teacher, leave them kids alone. Hey, teacher, leave them kids alone.
And we're back. Chloe, so you were explaining that they did not renew your contract. So where does that leave you?
Honestly, I was pretty devastated when I first found out. I was initially told in February that they would not be renewing my contract. And I, immediately started searching for other ethnic studies jobs in the area. Teaching ethnic studies is something I'm really passionate about. And I feel like if I were to give up on teaching ethnic studies, then I would essentially be giving these groups what they wanted. And I know in my heart that the impact that I've had, the positive impact I've had on my students, particularly my students of color, has outweighed any negative impact that may have happened from this one lesson. But after a very long process, because honestly, I was blacklisted from a lot of jobs, a lot of schools didn't even get back to me because when you look up my name, there's just it just looks like a hot mess. There's a lot of articles labeling me as an anti-Semite. And I ultimately did get a job for next year. I will be continuing to teach ethnic studies, but I'm going to be teaching ethnic studies at Notre Dame in downtown San Jose, which will definitely be different from what I had envisioned for myself, but something that I'm also really excited for.
Thank you for sharing that, Chloe. Well, now that I've asked all the guests just a few questions, I want to make it kind of like a panel, and if people can jump in and answer these, that would be great. I guess my kind of a broad question would be, isn't history always propaganda? Are we okay, we're fighting about this now, but aren't people always fighting about history?
I can jump in on that. Yes. I think when I first heard that there were complaints about my lesson, I had a meeting with my principal, and he asked me if I thought that the lesson was presented in a non-biased way. And I said, well, every single thing that I present is biased. There's no way to escape bias. Even if I asked an artificial intelligence to create something, that would still have a bias because its creators have bias. There's no way around that. And that's part of what I try to teach my students, is that you have to figure out what that bias is and then use that to help you critically think about why that source might be saying what it's saying. Also, I do think ethnic studies in particular is a social justice class, and it's about empowering people in their identities, and it's about talking about community strength and power, and that is inherently political. And I think that that's okay sometimes, but I think that that's something a lot of people are scared to say, especially in a public education realm.
The conclusion that we have to draw when we witness what has happened to Chloe and to other faculty, other teachers, other ethnic studies practitioners who've dared to teach anything on Palestine is that, the conclusion that we have to draw is that any kind of critique of the state of Israel comes with consequences. A healthy democracy means that we can examine and criticize our own government? What kind of message is it sending that we can't criticize a foreign government? I really have to ask that question. And the other thing, too, that was so lamentable about AB 101 is that Newsom basically caved, and so did Tony Thurmond. And so in the language of AB 101, it says, it's come to our attention that there were areas of the first draft of the model curriculum that fell into the category of bias, bigotry, and discrimination. And of course, there should be guardrails around that area. What that was essentially stating was that any mention of Palestine is impermissible, that to even utter the term Palestine is to be biased, bigoted, and discriminatory. And that is a form of violence on the order of knowledge, which is unacceptable. What we're being told is that basically any articulation of Palestinian life and the right to live is somehow inherently anti-Semitic. And we are seeing in this McCarthyist moment heads roll for that. So this is also what happened in PVUSD. Basically, two people who don't even have students, kids, their own kids in the school district, came and alleged that Alison Tintiango Cubales is anti-Semitic because of the inclusion of Palestine in the first ethnic studies model curriculum. I think that we all have an obligation to safeguard against the erosion of democracy. I really do. And, what happened to Chloe is completely outrageous. What we're witnessing in PVUSD, this is something that I think that people should know about the state of California. To some degree, it's a MAGA nightmare. Why? Because 80% of the school-going population are students of color. And in Watsonville, it's almost 90%, and it's majority Latinx. And two people who come to the school board meeting and tank ethnic studies, they're tanking it. One of the people actually stated that he didn't agree with 99% of the people who go to the school board meetings. He's admitting that he's in the 1%, and he feels completely justified tanking ethnic studies, which has proven results in improving academic performance overall for students from historically marginalized backgrounds. We, as a matter of actually implementing good public policy, would do well to support ethnic studies. Ethnic studies, it's not, ethnic studies, and the studies have shown this, it actually benefits not only students from communities of color, but students from white communities. And what happened to Chloe, I'm just sorry, it is a disgusting outrage.
Thank you, Christine. I want to bring it back to Maximiliano. I think we were talking about an example of, I think you said it's a life-changing course. And did you have an example to share now?
An example of how it changed my life?
Yeah.
Well, it has changed my life in a lot of different ways. Well, I'm sort of like a mini activist now.
Oh, wow.
I go to the school boards most of the time. I've kind of been taking a break because finals are coming up, but
yes, the end of the school year.
Yeah, most every other week I would go to the school boards. I went to the town hall. I'm essentially getting involved now. Ethnic studies has made me realize that, although there are a lot of issues, that it's not set in stone, and that if we, organize, if we take action, then we can change. That society is not a firm structure, that it's sort of malleable.
And I'll jump in really quick. Maximiliano has also been educating a lot of the students. As he talks about it, students who aren't in the class have become curious, and they ask him questions. And so he's kind of become like a little mini educator within his school and his group of friends that want to know, like, well, tell me more about this. Tell me more about this. So he's right in saying that he's become a little activist.
Okay.
If I may jump in on that, this is a prime example why ethnic studies is so needed, because it builds leaders like this. This young man right here has become a leader because of ethnic studies. He's speaking out for rights and things that are going on in his school, and he's becoming an example, and he's exercising his rights to become a leader and fight for what's right.
Yeah, I can't remember any time. There was no time when I was going to school in which any of us fought for any class. So it's just so exciting to hear that students are so passionate about this class. Chloe, I want to ask you, in your time teaching ethnic studies, what did you observe about like the impact on your students? Because I think you were saying you are the advisor for the BSU, and you were the only black teacher, the certificated black teacher in your high school. Did I recall that correctly?
Yes, you're correct. I feel like I definitely noticed ethnic studies having a positive impact on my students, all of my students, regardless of race. I think teaching at Menlo-Atherton, like I said, was really unique because students come from two very distinct communities. And in the freshman year, which is the year we teach ethnic studies, students are coming from so many different middle schools, and they really initially self-segregate themselves. And I found ethnic studies to be really impactful in kind of, I guess, integrating the students and getting them to actually learn from a student who's from a different neighborhood from them, and then maybe build a friendship. As far as the Black Student Union goes, I just noticed when it came to having a space where the Black students felt like they could go on a regular basis, that helped improve their attendance. And it's been really heartbreaking since I've been let go. At least 2 Black students have told me explicitly that they're not coming to school as often because they're sad that I'm not going to be there. The only other Black teacher on my campus is a student teacher, and she won't be there next year either. So it's really a devastating loss for the students. And I think that a lot of times they get left out of the picture when all of these different political stakeholders are arguing over what's ethnic studies and what's not. And really, at the end of the day, it's the students who get harmed by that.
Thank you, Chloe. I think that somebody's going to read a promo.
Sorry, can I jump in real quick? I wanted to clarify one of my, I wanted to answer one of the earlier questions about an example of how ethnic studies, can help you trace things back to their roots. Because something I hear a lot, or something that Republicans like to say, or conservatives like to say, is that Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. And when you go back in history, you realize that there was kind of a shift where Republicans tended to be the more progressive people and Democrats tended to be the more conservative people. And so, and it's kind of like a history thing, but in ethnic studies, you kind of break it down a little more. And again, that's one of the examples of how in ethnic studies, you can sort of figure out why things are the way they are, like why the status quo is the status quo right now. Sorry.
Thank you, Maximiliano. I'm going to read a promo to tune in to KSQ at 6 p.m. That's right after this show for the Babblery hosted by Suki Westling for a look at motherhood in the 21st century. In this time of social media oversharing, young women may get the message that mothering is all about drudgery and missing out on opportunities. But the many women featured in this episode of the Babblery say it's all worth it. They describe the intense pleasure that comes with birthing, adopting, and raising children. That's the Babblery exploring women's lives this evening at 6 p.m. right here on KSQD at 90.7, 89.7, and 89.5 FM and ksqd.org. The podcast is available for streaming anytime on ksqd.org. Yeah, and back to Talk of the Bay with me, Meilin Obinata, looking at the controversy about ethnic studies and the PVUSD. So, Bobby, I wanted to ask you about how prepared are California teachers to meet the requirement of teaching ethnic studies? What could possibly go wrong?
I mean, I don't know how prepared California teachers are in general. I know I was not prepared for creating the class myself with a team of teachers. And that's even being somebody who's passionate about social justice, who's constantly taking classes about it, trying to teach myself about it. I still wasn't totally sure how you go about creating a class like that. And so we had to do so much studying up on it. And so I think it was nice to have the CRE organization come in and help us out. And so then it makes me a little nervous, a little worried to think that school boards are going to start rejecting organizations like that based on things that they've heard or things that, people have told them. Like in our district, it was only 2 people, because that's going to deprive teachers of the training that they need to do ethnic studies correctly. And meanwhile, we're still moving ahead with the graduation requirement of kids that have to take this class in order to graduate. And so it seems like a bad combination of we're going to require kids to take this class, but we're not going to give teachers the training they need in order to teach the class well.
Thanks, Bobby. So one thing maybe people don't understand about ethnic studies is that it's not only the content, but a pedagogy. Mm-hmm. So it's a methodology of teaching, which might be different from how kids normally learn about history. Can someone, and that could be anybody, can somebody just explain why that matters? Why does the pedagogy matter?
I'll jump in and explain that, because this is something that I tell everybody about why I love that the kids have ethnic studies now. Because when I was in high school, I graduated in 1990, we didn't have ethnic studies. And when we were taught about racism, we were taught about it being something in the past. And so when I went away to college, I really thought like racism didn't exist, because we were taught that it's something that happened in the 50s and 60s with the civil rights movement. And I get to college and racism just smacks me in the face, and I was not really prepared to deal with it. And this is one of the reasons I was really happy that my children were taking ethnic studies, because I want them to be prepared to be able to face some of those challenges. And so that is one of the biggest differences, how it's taught, because the way it was taught was like, oh yeah, this is something that happened in the past. And it's not. I mean, it continues to be, once I took classes at college, I realized that I had dealt with a lot of microaggressions, that there was a lot of, racism. And even as a therapist, when sometimes my clients come in, they don't realize that some of the stuff they're dealing with is really rooted in racism. And I explain to them, and then they're like, oh, wow, I didn't realize that until now. And so it's really important to understand, not just like this is something from the past. It's ongoing, and it affects us every day.
So what happens when people have trauma from racism, but they don't know that's the source? How does that impact your work?
Well, once they know, and I think this is important about being a person of color too. It's like once I start explaining to them, like, here's where I think it's coming from. What do you think? And they start kind of processing, going like, you're right. And then it helps them, know that there's not necessarily a solution, but things they can do about it. The ways you can fight back. And so it empowers them to know that, oh, you know what? This isn't my fault. This isn't something that that I looked for. It was like, no, this is what happens to you because you're a person of color in society. And because, sometimes racism isn't, blatantly, racist. Sometimes people don't notice it. But when you're getting, like, even if you're getting little microaggressions every day, it does start affecting your mental health. And so being aware of that can already help you figure out things that you can do to protect yourself, learn protective factors.
I would love to build on that as well. I think that that was really beautifully put. And if students and people are unable to see that, the struggles that they face are a part of a bigger issue, they're missing out on this big piece of community as well. And I think that ethnic studies, like we've been saying, is not just what you teach, but how you teach it. And I do a lot of intentionality in trying to deconstruct power dynamics and trying to build relationships, sitting in community circles, creating a real classroom community so that students can then feel comfortable reflecting on their own experiences and their own communities and kind of calling out that racism that they see. Because if we don't acknowledge it, we can't change it. And if we don't acknowledge it, we feel alone and we feel like it's our fault. And so it's really a class that I think provides a lot of healing to the students as well.
Thank you, Chloe, and thank you, Lourdes, before that.
Could I also add something?
Sure, Christine.
Every other week when PVUSD has had its school board meetings, just as Maximiliano was saying, students who are in ethnic studies have been coming down and they have been holding court in the PVUSD space. And they are articulating and enacting a vision of education that serves the community. And it's profound to witness. There's also members of the community like Omar. There are teachers like Bobby. There are concerned parents like Lourdes and Gabe and others. There are many, many people from the community coming forward. And you can see that it's ethnic studies in action. Ethnic studies is not limited to the space of the formal classroom. And in fact, when ethnic studies first emerged, it really disrupted a kind of vision that was sold to isolated members of communities of color who were fortunate enough to get accepted to the UC or to get accepted to X, Y, and Z college. What was being sold to them was basically a notion of individual success. Like, come to college, learn this, and leave your community behind and, make a lot of money. And that was part of the sort of bargain of going to college. It wasn't necessarily democratizing generally. It, afforded different people individual uplift. But ethnic studies disrupted that vision. It said, come to school, but serve the community. And actually look at who produces knowledge and whether or not the voices of your community and the knowledge they have is represented there. And so, it's a fundamentally different orientation, and it's a broadly democratizing orientation.
Thank you, Christine. I just want to share with everybody I was watching or listening to some podcast, and the director, Boots Riley, was talking about the first time someone floated how he learned about activism. And it was because someone said, "Oh, Boots, let's go to the beach, let's have a fun time." And what he didn't know is that he was going to Watsonville and he was meeting with cannery activists. And he just, from there, I'm sure he got to see the beach, but that's how he learned about activism. It was from people from Watsonville. And we have one more minute. Does anybody want to take like 15 seconds to say anything they didn't get to say?
I think it's important that we keep on educating our youth and supporting them in everything that they do, especially like Maximiliano, such a young guy that's very motivated. And like he said, he's got that spark, that activism in him, and we need to empower those kind of students and support them in everything they do to make those changes in our community, because I think that the big battle is going to be won by the students.
Thank you, Omar. You've been listening to Talk of the Bay with your host, Meilin Obinata. We've had our guests, Omar Dieguez, Maximiliano Barrazas, Lourdes Barrazas, Bobby Pelz, Christine Hong, and Chloe Montgomery Gentile. Thank you so much, everybody, for spending this time explaining your perspectives and experiences with ethnic studies in the Pajaro Valley and beyond.